Good afternoon, friends. Let's get this presentation jump started. Excited to see so many of you interested in this topic. Again, I'm Ryan Fewens-Bliss, the Executive Director of the Michigan College Access Network. We're excited to talk to you about getting more students, getting more residents in the state of Michigan into community college districts. We're not going to talk about moving people from their homes into current districts. We're going to talk about the opposite, expanding districts. As many of you know, MCAN is firmly focused on 60 by 30. Our mission calls us to expand access and ultimately success for students of color, first-generation college-going students, and low-income students across the state. We find that lots of folks who don't have ready access are in rural areas, the Upper Peninsula, the thumb of Michigan. We want to make sure we can expand affordable access to those students as well. So several months ago, when the state launched their amazing programs for tuition-free certificates and degrees for adults 25 and above, the Michigan Reconnect, into our frontliners, for Futures for Frontliners, we were really excited to celebrate that. We quickly heard some feedback from some of you who live in communities or work in communities that are not currently in a college district, community college district, that folks in your area were not being able to get the actual tuition-free promise that we thought was coming with those programs. And so I talked to our friends at the state, I talked to some of our friends who are going to present today, and we thought a good use of our time, a good use of our energy, a good use of our voice is to talk about how we can get more students into community college districts. So they'll be able to access more affordable post-secondary education and perhaps take advantage of some of those state scholarship programs like folks who are living in community college districts. So thanks to many of you who reached out to MCAN and said, we'd love to talk about this. When we launched this registration, we have almost 200 people who are interested in this topic. So we know we've hit on something very key. So ultimately, I'm excited to introduce our friends on the call today. Erin Schor, who's the Vice President at the Michigan Community College Association, and Scott Mertes, who is a Vice President at Mid-Michigan College. When we decided to do this, I thought those are the two folks we got to go after. Erin and MCCA know the legal rules and how these things operate and understand the layout of community college districts across the state. And Scott just successfully helped lead his college into annexing more territory in order to expand their community college district. So what you're going to hear is Erin's going to tell you about sort of the just the facts, ma'am type of information about how to do this, how it works, the history and legal reasons behind things. And then Scott's going to give you a more narrative presentation on how they were able to do this, what they learned along the way. I've heard Scott talk about this a couple of times, and every time I find little nuggets of information to pull out that I didn't realize before. Ultimately, we really believe at MCAN that if more students reside in community college districts and can access more affordable post-secondary education, we can get to 60 by 30. So in that spirit, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Erin Schor from Michigan Community College Association. Take it away, Erin.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today. I'm excited to have so many folks from across the state who are interested in this topic. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. I'll just speak a little bit more generally and then sort of narrow in for Scott about how they handled their campaign. But just to begin, for anyone who's not familiar with the term annexation, it's used in a variety of contexts, but it really means bringing in an area or addition to something that's already existing. And that might be joining it to an existing city to extend a road or a sewer system or something like that. Or in our case, it would be annexing to a community college district to allow for better services in the other areas that are not currently part of a district. You want to go to the next slide. Michigan is somewhat unique across the country in that if you look at this map, you can see only about 50% of the geographic landmass of the state is covered by a community college district. We have a very decentralized system of government here in Michigan. And so under the Community College Act of 1966, as these colleges were formed, they were allowed to determine what their territory would be back at the beginning. So colleges can form by counties, one or more counties. They can be one school district or a collection of school districts. They can be by ISD. And we have colleges that fit all of those different types, as you can see from the map. We've run the numbers. I probably put together a calculation again about 2 years ago. And even though there's a lot of white space on this map and it only covers about 50% of the geographic area, about 80% of the population already lives within a community college district. It is in Wayne County. It's just out there for description purposes, as you can see it. But Schoolcraft and Henry Ford are also within Wayne County. They don't overlap each other. Wayne County Community College District has the rest of Wayne County. In terms of population that's not within a community college district, frankly, most of it is not in, for example, those wide swaths of white space within the Upper Peninsula. Most of it is very close to an existing college district. It's in suburban Lansing and those little counties to the north or west. It's in Ottawa County to the west of Grand Rapids and the south of Muskegon, or in something like Livingston County right there between Lansing and Oakland. So there's a lot of potential for people who are close to an existing district, but not within one, to improve that relationship and bolster it and get better and less expensive services. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. And part of how we got to this position, for those, I know there's a variety of backgrounds on the call. Community colleges in Michigan have 3 different primary sources of funding. Those are state appropriations, which range dramatically across the 28 public community colleges, but on average, that makes up 21% of the revenue at a community college. Local property tax is 35% on average of what a community college brings in terms of their revenue. And this is really key to the difference between in and out, because people who live in that community college district on average are paying 2.7 mils for the privilege of being within a community college district. And for those of you who aren't tax policy experts, what that means is that on average, if you have a $200,000 house, say, in Michigan, we cut that value in half. And on $100,000, that would mean you're paying $270 a year in taxes to be part of the community college district. And for that, you receive a tuition benefit. Tuition and fees is the remaining 37%. There's about 5% that's grants and other things on average. But as you can see, for people who live in a community college district, it's almost half the tuition rate on average for people who are outside of a district because of that property tax millage that they pay. And again, the millage varies widely. There's some, like you'll hear from Scott, Mid-Michigan has a very low tuition rate, and some of them are up into the 3 and even close to 4 mils. But because the voters and the taxpayers in those districts support the college, and that's critical to the operations, it's a full third of their funding, it is important to reflect that in the benefit that families and businesses get in tuition and fees. If you want to go to the next slide. This was already becoming more of an issue. We have had an increasing importance on college education back when they were founded in the 50s and 60s. That was the beginning of more people needing to go to college and the baby boomers starting to grow the pool of people who were going. But clearly a college education is more important today than it has ever been. Same thing, the dual enrollment laws were passed in 1994. And so we have seen increasing challenges for schools that are outside of a district that are trying to make that work for their students. But as Ryan mentioned, this really has particularly come to light with the Michigan Reconnect law that was signed into law in March of 2020, and then Futures for Frontliners that the governor did with the first round of federal funding created for people who had been working during the early portion of the pandemic to get them that tuition-free benefit. And we certainly heard from colleges that had large numbers of students coming, thinking it was going to be a full tuition benefit for them, and then discovering that because they live outside of a district, it would only cover that in-district portion of the costs. We had a lot of discussion with the administration when Reconnect was being drafted. And ultimately, colleges felt like it was important for the state to recognize, as they put those programs together, that colleges do depend on those millages. And if everybody gets the same benefit from Michigan Reconnect and Futures for Frontliners, regardless of whether they're paying the millage or not, then there's just not much incentive for voters to continue paying those property taxes. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So Scott just has one example, the most recent and the first successful one we've seen in a very long time of what the actual process is to annex to a community college district. I don't know if you want to take questions now, Ryan, or if you want to wait and go through both of us before we go to that stage.
Why don't we jump into Scott and we can take questions at the end?
Sounds good.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in then. Thanks, Ryan, for finding that picture of me. That isn't the worst one that's out there, so I'll take it. My name is Scott Mertes, and I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Community Outreach at Mid-Michigan College. For those that don't know, most of you probably do, but Mid is located pretty much in the center of the state, as our name implies, with our main campus in Harrison. And of particular interest for this conversation, we have another campus in Mount Pleasant, which historically has generated more credit hours and serviced more students than our campus in Harrison. So for years, it begged the question, why isn't Mount Pleasant in your district? And really not just from residents, but from students. Every time they came to pay a tuition bill and they had to pay out district, they said, well, I live in Mount Pleasant. And we had to explain, well, no, you don't. We are located in Mount Pleasant, but you are out district because you do not pay a millage rate to support the college. So over the course of the years, it has become exceedingly interesting for us to sort of banter about that question of, do we annex or do we not? And eventually we did. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. If we could hit the next slide, please. Get off my face there a little bit. Thank you. So Erin had defined annexation already in sort of a technical sense, but really when it gets down to it from our perspective, annexation is really nothing more than an invitation. Michigan is a fiercely independent higher education state, and I mean, I don't need to reiterate that to all of you. There is no centralized Department of Higher Education that sort of controls these types of decisions. Each college is governed by a locally elected board of trustees, and it's up to that board as to whether the decision is made to expand or not. Residents that pay property taxes to support the college, as Erin had reiterated, is in district, our in-district population, and they receive the in-district tuition rate. This can be done, annexation can be done in any number of ways. We actually tried two of these ways. It can be done by county. There are some community colleges, I think Delta, if we have any friends from Delta on the line right now, is made up of 3 counties in their entirety. If that doesn't apply to you, it still may have an impact on your annexation attempt, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. There are those that are chartered by RESD, which Mid is our home district since 1965, was the residents of the Clare Gladwin RESD territory, which encompassed 5 different school districts. It can also be done by individual school district and even by individual township. So the Community College Act of 1966 does give some leeway as to how residents or how community colleges can choose to do that. And just because you are chartered by one particular way, we are chartered by RESD, doesn't mean you can't choose the others. But again, there are some logistical issues that need to be sort of worked out if you move in a different direction like that. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this quick video. This is one that we, when we went out on the road and met with a variety of constituents and townships and commissions and so on and so forth. Annexation was a confusing concept for folks. They didn't know what it meant. So I wanted to show this video to you. It's a nice little short summary of what we're talking about and how the process works. So if you can hit play.
Annexation is a relatively simple concept, but to understand it, you first need to know about how community colleges in Michigan are organized. Each of Michigan's community colleges was chartered to serve a specific geographic area. Those areas can either be by county or counties, or by intermediate school district or school districts. But not all areas in Michigan have an in-district community college. Mid-Michigan College became Michigan's 25th community college in 1965, when voters living in the Clare Gladwin RESD passed a millage to support college operations. That means that residents living in this area support the college with 1.2232 mills levied on their property taxes. In exchange, these residents pay reduced tuition prices and comprise the college's board of trustees to provide governance and oversight for the college. For Mid, in-district tuition is 40% less than out-district tuition. In 2020-2021, tuition rates are $132 per contact hour for in-district students and $220 contact hour for out-district students. According to the Community College Act of 1966, a community college's district can expand through annexation, thereby offering the benefits of reduced tuition and college governance seats to new geographic areas. So, a community college's board of trustees can invite communities that aren't currently a part of any community college to join their district. Mid's board of trustees have formally invited the Gratiot Isabella RESD to join its service area. That requires that voters living in the GIRESD vote to accept annexation and the college's current millage rate of 1.2232 mills. If both ballot proposals pass, then residents in the GIRESD will join residents in the Clare Gladwin RESD and become part of Mid's in-district area. They will then receive the same benefits as the college's current in-district community members.
Okay, we can stop this one and move on to the next slide. There was a couple of juicy nuggets that were buried into that presentation, including a not too well veiled swipe at the difference in tuition and the mention of our millage rate of 1.2232 mills. As Erin had listed before, the average was 2.7 mills and generally makes up about a third of most community colleges' budget. We decided to move ahead with annexation because our millage rate is much lower than that, and about 70% of our budget at the time was based on tuition and fees. And that led to some extreme instability in times like we are now with declining enrollments. There's only so much you can raise tuition, and if you can't attract or retain additional students, it puts the college at risk from a financial standpoint. So we went out to seek annexation, not necessarily from a standpoint that we need to bring in additional revenue, but we need to stabilize the revenue sources that we had. So I'm going to go over just some real nuts and bolts of it first, just to sort of lay the foundation, and then talk about some of the other things that we learned, and then we'll kind of move on from that. But in terms of the real nuts and bolts of where do I start with this? First of all, you really need to look at, is there sufficient interest within the communities themselves to annex? Now, I know Ryan had said he had some conversations with some folks that said, hey, we really want to look at this. That's wonderful. And it's great that there's interest, but you really want to talk to the folks that are going to be heading into the voters booth to decide whether they want to raise their own taxes. That is always the 800-pound gorilla on the block. And for Mid, while our millage rate is relatively low and our property values are relatively low, so the cost, while on average is about $270 a year, for Mid, it's actually about $56 a year based on our median household value in this area. It's still a difficult sell. So as you get out and start to look at things and explore the possibility of annexing a community or communities, really go where the people are And at this point, it should be an informal type discussion. This is a Board of Trustees decision at some point. It has to be an official resolution where they invite communities. So obviously you want to engage your board and keep them up to date on this, but the initial discussion should be more informal at this point, just to gauge interest, to see what people are thinking when it comes to this. And some of these bullet points can be interchanged. Like I listed number 3 as lay the groundwork. That can certainly come earlier than that if you feel it's necessary. We commissioned 2 separate studies before we really decided to present to the board for a vote on officially inviting districts. One of those was an economic impact study. The company we used is MCAN. I think that stands for Economic Modeling Survey Inventory or something along that line. But this group was very instrumental at coming up with information that talks about the economic impact MID had on its community. Things like MID supports 1 out of every 40 jobs in the Gratiot Isabella territory. MID's economic impact annually is $67 million. MID's overall value, if you were going to put a value on it, is $500 and some odd million. Those are important as you go out in the community to talk about what's the benefit for them, because in the end, that's really going to be what they ask. So we commissioned that study. We also commissioned a study from a group called Epic MRA. And point number 1, where we talked to community leaders, it was informal. That was wonderful. But what Epic MRA did for us was sort of proportionalize the number of voters by district as a percentage, and then contacted them and asked them various questions to gauge real serious interest on whether you were planning on voting yes or no or undecided, or what would it take for you to decide. Thank you, Chris Hammond, our former president. Nice to well, not see you, but at least see a message from you. So Epic MRA was really, really helpful in contacting those folks to gauge what is our likelihood for success here. What are our voters going to tell us when they actually get into the booth? We chose to do that before we presented to the board, so we could inform them this is what our communities are saying. The board then votes officially to offer an invite. As I said early on, we did it twice. The first one was by RESD. The second one was by individual school district, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Then you have to work with your attorney on official ballot language. And if you noticed in the video, there were 2 separate proposals. This is critical. There's no way around it. There has to be 2 proposals. 1 essentially asks, do you want to join the district? 2, can we assess the millage rate onto your taxes? Both have to pass majority yes. And that is a tricky, tricky thing. It also requires approval from the state superintendent. I'm going to say now, for those of you that eventually do attempt annexation, you're welcome. We have not done this in a really, really long time. So the state superintendent's office struggled to figure out what's the precedent here. What do we do with this? The people that I work with from that office were fantastic, but it took a little bit of time. And moving forward, next time, for anybody that's interested, should have a much better knowledge on how this works. But eventually, you're going to want to take the board resolution, the ballot language, and that state superintendent letter of approval and deliver it to the county clerks by the appropriate election deadline. That's absolutely critical to get on the ballot and necessary. And depending on how you annex, there may be some additional steps in there about getting individual school board approval and so on and so forth. Luckily, we didn't have to do that, but it's worth checking out. So those are just some real hard nuts and bolts of things that have to happen if you do want to get something on the ballot for your voters to decide on. Next slide, please. This is some of the softer stuff that we decided to do, but others may decide to do it a little bit differently. We found great value in building a group of community leaders that we called Friends of Mid-Michigan College. It's critical on 2 fronts. Number 1, colleges are not allowed to advocate for themselves when it comes to annexation, not on work time, not using work resources. If it's after hours, that's one thing. If you're coming as a representative of the Friends of Mid-Michigan group, that's one thing. But me going to a group as the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Mid-Michigan College, I'm not allowed to advocate on our behalf. Our friends, on the other hand, can advocate up one side, down the other. And they were really, really helpful for things like letters to the editor, other types of informal communication tracks. Some of them sent out notes of support on our behalf to their memberships or their customers and so on and so forth. Really, really wonderful group to help really turn those votes into yes votes. Also, as you're doing this, consider your budget. What are you willing to spend on this? College cannot spend its own funds on advocacy. However, you can spend them on educating the community. So if you want to do things like, this is what the tuition reduction will be if it passes, this is what it means, these are the benefits, those are all factual. That can be shared. If you want to say, and we really want you to vote yes, that's advocacy, and you cannot use college dollars to do that. That's why you need to engage your college foundation and others to provide that type of support that you're going to need to do that. Also, it's really, really critical to go to where people are. This is in the areas that we were considering, they're very rural areas. So not everybody is going to be covered by a Chamber of Commerce or economic development or something along that line. It's really critical to reach out to those folks who aren't going to attempt those types of things. And we looked at things like Friday folders in schools. We had all kinds of radio ads with certain demographics playing at certain times and billboards and all the traditional types of things, social media and MLive and all of that. But it's something that, number 4, your outside marketing consultant can really help you develop to target those specific areas that you know. Who is likely to vote for your proposals and how do you reach them? Very critical stuff. Next slide, please. Some things that we learned, I say lessons from the trenches because we went through 2 bruising campaigns. I'll show you the results of the first one in a second and what led us to the second attempt. But what we learned, first of all, you have to really think about, is this worth it from a financial standpoint? For us, being as though that our Mount Pleasant campus generated more credit hours and serviced more students, there was a time where out-district money surpassed what we would get in millage rate. Again, our attempt was not necessarily for a truckload of additional money, but more so stabilize our funding sources. But if you're servicing students in those out-district areas and collecting out-district tuition, it's worthwhile to at least consider that. The 2 questions that I got along the road by far, what is in it for me and what's it going to cost me? So as you design marketing materials and prepare presentations to present to folks, spend some time working on those. In particular, for us in rural areas, there was not so much of a brand recognition for Mid-Michigan College and in Southern Gratiot and some other areas. So it's really critical to answer those questions when they come up. Well, what's it mean for me? What's it going to give me? And some messages that sold for us, in particular with the pandemic, is the real value of frontline healthcare workers. That was something that we talked about ad nauseum and tried to tie that very much to Michigan Reconnect and other measures as well. Consider the ballot timing. If it's a national type election where the ballot is already going to come out and there's already things on the ballot, you don't necessarily have to pay for that. But if you go for more of an off election year, as we did on the second time around, for every single school district except for one, we were the only thing on that ballot, which means we picked up the tab for all of it. That is something to consider. And you're also going to consider what your turnout is going to be. For our first attempt was in November 2020. That was a presidential election. And one way or the other, it drove out voters from all sides. We had about, in our areas of service, we had about between 60 and 70% vote rates, which is phenomenal for any election. Our second attempt was the following May. As I said, we were the only thing on the ballot and our voter rates were about 10%. That can dramatically impact your chances as to whether it passes or not. Considering how you want to annex, that sort of ties back to what I just said. The first time around, we annexed by the RESD, or we attempted to, which means that regardless of how it passed in individual communities, it had to pass both proposals majority in the entire RESD region. So even though Mount Pleasant and Alma and some others voted yes in the first time around, other communities voted no, just a little bit more than they voted yes, so nobody got to take advantage of it. The second time around, we gave each individual school district the option to vote yes or no, but we had much lower turnouts, and that definitely impacted things. So you'll want to consider that as well as to how you want to do it and when you want to do it. One thing that we learned very much is that voters were confused by having two proposals on the ballot. We asked our attorney, we begged our attorney, can we just truncate it into one? And we can't do that. But we found, I'll show you the results in just a second here, but we found by and large, yeah, we want to join the district, but no, we don't want to pay taxes on it. And if it's no on the second one, even though the first one passes, it's no in its entirety. So make sure you spend some time working on messaging to notify voters of that, and be prepared for some messes. It's just going to happen. This is not done very often in the state of Michigan. So we had some confusion among the county clerks, particularly when some of the RESD territory resided in a county that was already covered by a community college district. Those voters do not get a chance to vote. So you have to eliminate them from the voter totals. They don't get the option to vote yes or no on this. And that takes some work on the part of the county clerks. And they did a wonderful job, but it is going to be some navigation through that. And even afterwards, if you're fortunate enough to pass, as we did the second time around, it's going to take some work on identifying who's in what address. And we have a large university in our backyard. How does it work with them in terms of whether CMU students are in district or out district for us? They're not paying property taxes per se because they're in apartments, but we took the line that their landlords are and likely passing that on to the renters. So we do consider them in district, but those are just some of the things that you do have to sort of monkey with as if you're fortunate enough for it to pass. And next slide, please. This is what the official ballot proposal looks like. As I said, there has to be two, and there has to be certain things that are included in there that your attorney will work with you to make sure that they are. But again, make sure you spend some time messaging that both of them have to pass yes. And this is really kind of a non-negotiable. The only thing that changes is how you attempt to annex, and the wording will be a little bit different based on that. But just wanted to give you just a sneak peek of what people are going to look at when they get into the ballot box. Next one, please. So these are some of our official results from the first time around that I just wanted to present to you. And this reiterates the point pretty clearly. When you look at proposal 1, that is, do you want to join MIDS district? You see, it was more than a 2-to-1 margin. Yes, we want to join MIDS district. When you look at proposal 2, which is, do you want to support MID with property tax dollars? No, by a very small number of votes. It's difficult. And it also, this demonstrates some of the difficulty of sort of boundary lines because we were attempting to annex by RESD. You'll see Montcalm County had all of 6 votes. And the natural thought is, well, geez, Montcalm County is located in Montcalm Community College's district. They are, except for one tiny little sliver that is not, but is in the Gratiot-Isabella RESD territory. Of course, only 6 people voted on that, split right down the middle. Those voters must have just arm wrestled with that vote. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like and the challenges that you're going to face in terms of messaging and how it worked out for us. Next slide, please. This is a heat map of what voting looked like. And the reason why I put this in, you'll notice the top county or area there is Isabella County for the most part. The bottom one is Gratiot County. And you'll see some real hot red areas. This is our first attempt in November, where we had almost 70% of the populace voting in that election. If we would have done it by individual school district at that time, there's quite a bit of red around, and likely some of those school districts would have passed, even though the RESD territory as a whole came up just over 500 votes short because of how we attempted annexation. If we would have attempted it a different way, we would have had a lot more vote yes and have a lot more of those school districts in our territory right now. However, when we voted or when we attempted it the second time around in May, much smaller turnout, only about 10% voted. So some of those areas that were hot red in November, were not hot red in May. And as a result, they didn't pass annexation the second time around. So those are all the type of matrix that you have to consider as you look forward to whether you're going to do this or not, and speaks to the timing and the type of election and the way that you're going to attempt annexation and how those decisions may impact your voting. Next slide, please. That is all I have. I'm sure we're going to open up for questions later, but I'm going to turn it back to Ryan, and he can finish it up.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Erin. We're going to open ourselves to questions here. You can place those questions in the Q&A or place them in chat. If you've put a question into chat, I've scooped it up and we'll get to it in just a moment. While you put your questions into those areas for our speakers to address, I want you to tell you a little bit about what MCAN can do to support you in your efforts to get to 60 by 30. Many of you know these things, so I'm going to breeze over them, but I just want to reiterate, MCAN's here to help local communities, colleges, K-12 schools, businesses, governments, whoever wants to help increase post-secondary attainment in the state. We're here to help. We have grants for high schools and colleges and communities. We've got professional development, especially for school counselors. Many of you are familiar with our college advisor program within high schools called Advise Michigan, and our college completion coaches who are in certificate and associate degree programs in community colleges and tribal colleges. We also do a lot of public policy and advocacy to try to increase. In fact, today I was having a conversation with an elected official about increasing financial aid for students in the state in the next budget. So we try to encourage the legislature, the executive offices, the governor's office to do things that are pro 60 by 30 and ultimately pro student. Many of you probably saw at the beginning of last month, just about 30 days ago, we launched the Michigan Echo Scholarship based on the Futures for Frontliners Scholarship for those that are not eligible for federal financial aid. So folks that are in specific types of citizenship situations, DACA recipients, TPS, asylum pending, special juvenile students as well. So if you've got students that fit into those categories, we'd love to support their certificate or degree over the next few years. And then we've got lots of data and other supports that we can offer communities, again, schools, colleges, whoever wants to increase the post-secondary attainment rate in Michigan to 60 by 30, we are alongside you. We also want to encourage and help communities that want to join community college districts. As both Erin and Scott mentioned, there's some legal play in there because it's a ballot issue and what you can advocate for and can't advocate for. So we've got a few limitations there as a nonprofit, but we'd love to be able to help you think about this work and find ways to be able to get more students into a community college district. As always, if you want to know anything about any of these programs, visit our website, micollegeaccess.org, or give us a call or drop us an email. Happy to answer all your questions and provide you supports. All right, I see lots of questions coming in, so I'll stop talking about MCAN and shift to talking with our guests here. One of the first questions we received, and Scott, you may want to answer this, and Erin, I'm sure you've got a weigh in on this. If you're in a community that has several community colleges nearby, how might you choose which of those community colleges your community wants to be annexed by? I'm thinking of our friends in Newaygo County and Oceana County. They're both experiencing that as well. How do you make a decision about where you go as a district?
Well, the nice thing is that that's more flexible than it used to be. Up until 2016, you had to be geographically contiguous to a community college district in order to annex yourselves to it. So you would have to get everyone next to the college to agree with you. We actually had a situation up north where Alpena Community College put an annexation question out to their area. And much like what happened with Mid-Michigan, the voters in Rogers City approved it, but the voters in Posen, which was in the middle, voted it down. And so Rogers City at that time couldn't join Alpena's community college district because they weren't contiguous, and the intermediary district said no. Scott can probably talk about some of the incentives at play right now. There's no particular legal limitations around which district you might want to join. We talked about that when the law changed in 2016, but ultimately decided, because it's about a relationship between a community and the college that they decide to join, that would be the most important thing to drive the process of which college would best serve a community's needs.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a difficult question too, and I love all of our brothers and sisters in the community college ranks. So it's a little bit awkward to say you should go with this one versus that one. But I do think if you're a community looking to see, hey, which one I should join, you probably want to look at the programs that they're offering as to what they line up. While they may be similar, there may be something that's unique. I think the most obvious thing is to look at millage rates. I hate to say that because I don't want this to turn into a shopping spree of I'm going to compare this one to this one because one has a lower rate. The fact that community colleges can now annex areas that are non-contiguous means that there are exponentially more options. But going with a community college that has a low rate, they're still going to have to invest in that area. They're still going to have to attract faculty. They're still going to have to build buildings and so on and so forth. So, looking at whether that college is going to truly invest in your area is a big question I would want answered rather than necessarily the lowest millage rate possible. But as I said, all 28 community colleges do an amazing job servicing their communities. So I don't think you could go wrong with any of them.
Thanks for that, both of you. Erin, I think the next question is probably best for you. Is this the same structure that California uses to make their community college free for their students?
I saw that question come in, so I took a second and looked it up, and it is similar. They have a college promise program, which is basically the same thing that we have in Michigan. We just had the previous, it was the Michigan Merit Scholarship Program, and then it became the Michigan Promise, and then we did away with it altogether. So when we came back to a new tuition-free program, we decided not to go back to the same name we had, but it's a similar program, even though California has a very different structure than we have in Michigan.
Thanks, Erin. Thoughts about a community that has half of their students in one community college and half of their students in another community college? Is there a way to get everybody into one community college or change who you're with once you've been annexed?
Well, Erin may correct me if I'm wrong, but at this point, there is no mechanism for leaving one and moving to another.
That's correct.
Yeah, it's a pretty slippery slope anyway, but yeah, at this point, no, not that I know of.
Mm-hmm. I think this ties in with some of the questions that I'm seeing later around a community like Livingston County, or I know we see it over in Ottawa where you're close to several. And one answer is you may not want to look at annexation with the entire county as a whole. Using Livingston as an example, someplace like Fowlerville that's very close to Ingham County might be more interested in annexing to LCC's district, where somebody down on the southern end of the county might want to look at Washtenaw, if that makes sense for them. There are communities that are truly split right on the border, and that's tricky. It becomes, I think, in that case, more a question of services and relationships than just geographic proximity.
Thanks. Scott, this one's for you. Does a Friends of committee need any official status, or is it just a grassroots group of individuals from the community?
It will need an official tax status if that group is going to be the one responsible for allocating those advocacy funds. Now, we created an account in the name of the Friends of Mid-Michigan College, which did require a separate tax ID and reporting and so on and so forth. So that is necessary, yes.
Mm-hmm. Along that vein, one thing for the group to be aware of, Scott talked a little bit about timing and how different elections can have different turnout and different costs associated with them. One thing for your college and your Friends of group to be aware of also is that under the ballot initiative that was passed in 2018, Michigan voters now have universal access to absentee voting. And that can have a huge impact on who votes and when that happens. I don't know what numbers Scott saw in their 2 elections, which both happened under the new law. In our local elections that took place this year, about 80% of the vote was done by mail. And those ballots have to be available by law at least 45 days before the election, which means if you're getting messaging out, you need to think about that in terms of your timing as well, because some voters will be voting much earlier than what you traditionally think about. In fact, many voters.
Yeah, that's a great point, Erin. And we did consider that on both campaigns just to try to capture that. We expected to see a lot more of it on the second one, but still only about 10% voted in that election of the communities we were looking toward. So if you're the only thing on the ballot, it may not necessarily be enough to motivate folks just to assume, well, it's mailed to them, so now that it's easier to vote, they'll vote. It doesn't always work out that way. It didn't work out that way for the second election for us, but it is critical that you move the timing up to encompass those voters who may be turning things in, particularly in a national election, much, much sooner.
Thanks. Next question, I think either of you can probably tackle. We've got many communities across the state that have a campus, have a building within their community, an outreach center for a community college. Does a community have to be annexed into a community college district in order to have a community college campus or building in that community?
We've got many. Actually, I've seen some of my friends from the Thumb reply. We've got several centers over there where we're sort of sharing space with the RESD. We've got them in Mecosta Osceola at their RESD there, Elma High School, as well as Clinton County RESA. So no, you don't have to be in that district in order to have services from that community college or a presence there. But if you want to pay the in-district tuition, you do have to pay property taxes to support the college.
Thanks. How about your opinion on annexation versus creating a whole new community college in a community that would serve that unserved community?
You know, that's a good question. And I think it comes to a lot of the dynamics going on in your community. I know this is a conversation that's been taking place on the west side of the state for several years. It's a big undertaking to start a new college. At this point, given the shrinking K-12 demographics, I feel like it would be a challenge when you look at the long-term numbers to justify a new. We already have, well, at one point it was 92 degree granting institutions in the state of Michigan. We're probably down 1 or 2 from that number at this point. But if your area is growing, then that might be worth considering. In general, I think communities, it's much easier to join something that already exists than start something from scratch.
I would agree 100%. You also have to factor in things like accreditation, hiring of staff and faculty. All of those are huge endeavors, and it's going to be a while before you actually get accredited by the Higher Learning Commission, which, can impact some things from a transferability standpoint, or it just creates an additional complication. I think by far it's wiser to have one annex you into their territory than to build one from scratch.
Thanks. Erin, this one's for you. Are your member community colleges talking about expansion like we are in the community? Is there interest from institutions?
Absolutely. This is something that's very interesting to community colleges, because in many cases, they're already serving those areas that are unincorporated. I think really the question from the college's perspective, as Scott alluded to, is what's the character of those communities? Are they ever going to be people that support additional millages? And what's their relationship to the college and the best way to move that forward? We know voters in some areas are just intrinsically more conservative than they are in other areas, and they are less likely to support a millage. There's different ways of setting up arrangements as well. There was reference to the center that they have in Livingston County, which is shared among several colleges. There's also an arrangement that Bay College has. I believe they're in Delta County, and Dickinson County is the one they have an agreement with, but I could have those flipped around, where the other county didn't actually annex, but they passed a millage. So they get their own special tuition rate that's not the same as either the normal in or out of district. And so that gets them an increased level of services from what they had previously, but not quite the full in district level of services. So there's numerous ways to go about these challenges.
Thanks, Erin. Scott, this one's for you. If approved, if the millage and annexation is approved, how often do you need to go for renewal? How does that work? How often do citizens need to agree again that they want to be in this district and be taxed in this way?
It depends on what you put in the ballot language. Ours is in perpetuity. When we passed the most recent one, it's in perpetuity. Obviously, if you can get that, that is phenomenal, where you don't have to go back and re-seek a millage renewal every certain period of time. So I know there are some community colleges that have done that or that do have to go back for renewals, but it doesn't mean that you have to. We're an example of that. And if that's something that can be done, I would really highly encourage to do that, because millage campaigns are difficult.
Thanks, Scott. This one I think both of you can address. What are your thoughts about having a promise zone type of program, which also uses tax increment financing, or uses tax increment financing, so gathers tax in a different way than a straight millage, versus annexation and having a millage? Do you have thoughts about what might be better or worse, or how a community might move forward with either?
I think there are different approaches. The promise zone can be more flexible because it's not limited to just the community college. For example, I know here in the Lansing Promise, you can get free tuition at LCC or a discount toward either MSU or Olivet, and there are different structures for all of the existing promise zones. We are currently at the cap for the number of promise zones that we can have in the state. So unless one of them goes away or they change the enabling legislation, we can't create any new promise zones right now. But that could certainly be an effort that we push for if there's demand. There's also some restrictions in terms of qualifying communities for a promise zone. So not every area of the state would be eligible to use that approach. But it is aimed at particularly areas of high need.
I don't really have anything to add that Erin didn't already say, so.
Thanks, Erin. Any last questions for our panelists before we wrap up? We've got one more slide that has the contact information for both, or for all of us, MCAN, MCCA, and MMC. If you've got more questions, please put them into the chat now. Any closing comments, Scott and Erin, as communities? I'm sure many people are sitting through this, have heard what you have to say. They're thinking, is this something I want to wrestle with? Is this something I want to pursue? Any sort of closing call to action you would give to folks who might be interested in this and not sure where to go next?
If you're truly interested, whether you're a college or whether you're a MCAN or some other organization that's interested in looking at this, start talking to your communities, form an exploratory group to start exploring some of these issues. You're not obligated to do anything. And even if you don't, having an exploratory group, it may help you determine needs of the community that you just didn't know about. And then you can address those and strengthen your case in later times when you might go and pursue millage at a later date. We found out pretty quickly on the first one that we had a real identity problem in the southern part of the counties. They just weren't that familiar with mid, and we had to really stop and think, what can we do to better service those communities? So when we got those answers or those questions, hey, what's in it for me? We had stronger answers. And even if you don't pursue, having that type of communication is valuable. So I would start there.
I think that's exactly right. I think these conversations and these efforts will be successful when they meet the needs of the community. I think building those relationships is critical, regardless of whether you're coming from the college side or from a school district or another entity. And ultimately, those are conversations we should be having regardless of whether or not we're pursuing annexation, just about whether we're meeting the needs of the community and the people in it.
Thank you both. One last question came through. Are there any MCAN grants available that would help folks pursue this effort? It's a really interesting question. I think the answer is probably yes. I think we have to be careful about what those grants go to pay for, what those grants can be used for. But again, ultimately expanding access for students is a core part of MCAN's mission. So we would love to be in business with you all to see if that can happen. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists today, Erin Schor from MCCA and Scott Mertes from MMC. I thought their remarks were really, really helpful as thinking through this somewhat complex issue of joining a community college district. I also want to thank Kate Wilme, our TFA intern, and Kirsten Nolan, one of our strategy assistants here at MCAN, for all their work on this event. I hope this has been helpful for you. As I mentioned before, you will get the presentation, the PowerPoint. You will get a recording or a link to this recording so you can share it with others. And all of the materials we'll send your way, along with an evaluation for you to give us some feedback if this was helpful for you or not, and if you require or are interested in further discussion on this topic. So thanks for spending an hour in a cold December day with us. We really appreciate your focus on 60 by 30 and your efforts for the state. Have a great day and have a great week. Bye-bye.